Australia's Prime Minister has said that the two gunmen who attacked a Hanukkah celebration at Bondi Beach are likely to have been motivated by ISIS ideology. The terror group grabbed the world's attention when it took over large swathes of Iraq and Syria in 2013, and it was either directly involved in or the inspiration for a number of attacks around the world in the years that followed. But more recently, we've heard less about ISIS and other Islamist terror groups. Can they still pose a threat, or should Western governments be more wary? So should they be more wary? I'm joined now by Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, who is a senior research fellow at RUSI focusing on jihadist groups. Antonio, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for being with us. Look, when many people think of ISIS, they will picture the group that swept through Iraq and Syria a decade ago. What does the group look like now?
Well, it's certainly much weaker than at its peak, but one should not assume it's completely crushed. And especially the last, I would say, year, there's been definitely a bit of a resurgence, particularly in Syria, for a number of reasons related to Syria specifically. Still struggling, for example, in Turkey, is not doing well in Afghanistan, is only doing well essentially in Syria and in some parts of Africa. So it's well past its peak, but it's not gone.
We've heard potentially about these two suspects training in the Philippines. Is ISIS active in the Philippines?
Well, they were. They've not been doing much recently, but certainly that the presence, especially 2017, was their peak there. They seem to be able to attract other jihadist groups reaching affiliations, and then they took some beating and they went underground. There were attacks afterwards, but that is not one of the main areas of operation. But in the south of the Philippines, there are areas where the hold of the government is not very strong. So, we know that there are training camps, there is some presence of extremist groups there. So, it's certainly possible that they would train there.
Are Western governments as focused on the threat that ISIS can still pose as they should be? I mean, is there a sense that many governments have slightly taken their eyes off the ball here?
Well, definitely, in general, the interest and the funding for counter-terrorism has gone down a lot in Europe, but also in the United States. There are definitely other priorities. And it's true that if you look at the Middle East, they were in a steep decline for years, but they're still quite strong, for example, in parts of Africa. And so the threat there is still present. And every year, the Turkish government says they detain hundreds of people, even thousands. Some people, of course, will be released because they're not guilty, but certainly they detain a lot of people on accusation of being members of the Islamic State. So clearly, and there are a mix of Turks, but mostly foreigners,
sure,
of various descriptions. So there is still something going on there. There are networks, there is recruitment. So it's still quite active. And of course, Turkey is important because, especially if you're a Turkish citizen, access to Europe is easy. So different if you're Afghan or if you are Central Asian or Syrian. If you're Turkish, you can just easily travel to Europe.
You mentioned Syria, and we know that 3 Americans were killed by the group in Syria at the weekend. How is ISIS thriving in Syria? Are they thriving particularly because there is still basically a state of chaos across much of Syria?
The main reason is that, of course, there's been a regime change in December last year, so a year ago, and the new government is really struggling between the need to kind of appease some of its neighbors, and especially Israel is very controversial because the new government is made up of various brands of radical Islamists. So clearly Israel is not very popular there. And also kind of trying to reach some kind of understanding with some of the ethnic and religious minorities. None of this is popular with some of their allies and even with people within their own ranks. So that's creating tension. There have been some clashes. So it's a fertile ground for ISIS to reassert itself because they can attract the hardliner from within the current government, and that can boost their ranks. And they seem to be quite hopeful about that. Clearly they seem to be optimistic about the chance of regaining ground. Many of the people are now, within the armed forces or the new government used to be but the Islamic State in the past, the people who defected
Yeah.
from the Islamic State. So some of them might be tempted to go back simply because ideologically they're diverging from the current president of Syria, al-Sharaa.
Look, and finally, there have been concerns that the Taliban rulers of Afghanistan have allowed Al-Qaeda to re-establish bases in that country. Could we be seeing a resurgence in Al-Qaeda as well?
Well, in reality, there have always been bases of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, I would say, possibly from 2001 in very remote parts of the country. Certainly from around 2004 and 2005, there were bases, and Americans themselves were never able to eradicate them. I think there is a bit of a, I wouldn't say so much resurgence in numbers. Al-Qaeda keeps a low profile, but now they have a new role for themselves. They are quite actively supporting the Pakistani Taliban fighting against the Pakistani government. They seem to see that as their mission, and they're quite active providing advice and some other forms of support, even some funding, some weapons. So they're focused on that now.
Thank you very much indeed. That is Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, who is a senior research fellow at RUSI, focusing on jihadist groups. Good to speak to you.
It would appear that there is evidence that this was inspired by a terrorist organisation, by ISIS. Now, some of the evidence which is being procured, including the presence of Islamic State flags in the vehicle that has been seized, are a part of that. Radical perversion of Islam is absolutely a problem. It is something that has been identified globally as a problem as well. ISIS is created by an evil ideology that has been called out, not just by the Australian government, but globally as well. Mental health centres, and I encourage all Australians affected by this tragedy to consider. We have passed legislation to outlaw hate speech, the first government to do so, to put in place those laws as part of our response to anti-Semitism.
His son, with whom he lived, was at one stage under the...
We have taken the report from the anti-Semitism envoy, and what we are doing is busy implementing it. And we talked about that yesterday. We went through the full range of measures which we are doing. I talked about it, including the hate speech, Nazi symbols, what we're doing on doxing, what we've done with the creation of the National Student Ombudsman, what we're doing with the education program on Together for Humanity in schools, as well as security, migration issues and cultural issues as well.
To combat anti-Semitism, your handpicked envoy, was that referenced?
I think what Australians want is to come together. What terrorists seek to do is to create division, is to create conflict, is to undermine social cohesion. At that time, we're a better country than that, and we can't allow their objective to be successful. And that is why we must come together as a nation. I think overwhelmingly that is the feedback that I get across the board of what people want to see.
2015, and it was recommended that it be issued in November 2015.